review process.
Yeah, that's the fine-tune reading. I often take the job descriptions when I'm writing a letter of recommendation, and I make an outline. I do paragraph breaks and talk to the person who I'm writing a letter for. So inviting someone in to help you read that description can be really helpful, because they'll notice something in it too. There's some other questions here, and I'm going to move through them. And Dana, I just want to say I'm going to hold off on your question about startups till just a little bit later, but I will make sure that we get to it. And there are a lot of questions about here about where to find job postings. And Noor and I were talking before this about how being on search committees right now, all the places we're trying to get it in: Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, journals linked to your field are going to be a great spot to look at. But I think as a default, I would say go to seek out the human resources page for whatever universities you're interested in, and look for where their job postings, their job announcements are listed, and figure out how their search engines work. Usually, it's really hard to fine tune those searches, I've found, but you can usually put in, is it full-time, is it part-time, is it tenure track, non-tenure track, as checkboxes, and you can put in keywords. Those, I think the university's own HR pages are good. In the Minnesota system, there's a specific question here. Each of the colleges will have a place to list that, but they also have a Minnesota State University consolidated page where they're going to put job listings for the whole system. And so sometimes it's checking individual institutions, but where it's summarized, it would be a main page for the state university system. The Twin Cities Human Resources Office lists them all for the system, but you can go to Crookston and also do some searching and find out what's at Crookston. I think that's taking in most of those questions. I'm just going to scan and say again, Noor, what would you add?
Yeah,
There's
so
something on knowing people and how important that is, and I think you can speak to that, I think, handle it.
Yeah. So the part about networking to know people, for me, it's still very important to have a network of support, people who are familiar with the kind of interest that you have, kind of institution, kind of place where you want to be in case you do miss some postings. So it's really important to know that. And also to get information from those people as much as you can about what they're looking for at that institution. So not just seeing a posting and not having anybody at the place where you're interested in, but being able to get some information about what that particular position is looking for, what kind of candidate that could help you better prepare as an applicant.
I also did a thing when I was in PhD school of writing to everyone I knew in Minnesota who was still attached to academic work, because I knew I wanted to and needed to move back, and ask them to send me any job postings they saw, because they also wanted me to move back. So there was that bonus. And I was open to tenure track or non-tenure track. And Cynthia, that's your question. One of the things with tenure track is you're going to have a split that says it's teaching, research, and service, and that they're evenly split. But of course, research is going to be 3/4 of your job, and your promotions are going to be based on research. And yes, there are certain guarantees there, like at mid-tenure review is 3 years, and you find out if you're going to move ahead or what you need to move ahead. And at 6 years, you turn in another dossier, and in your 7th year, you find out either that's your last year, or you have tenure and you can move from assistant to associate, and then later you apply for full. So there's no guarantee there any more than there is for a non-tenure track position. So with a teaching professor or an education specialist, we also did something similar, but the tenuring, the process was built more on teaching, and service and research was the minor part. So it shifts those 3 things in terms of what's the more important part. So, there's some job security stuff, but also in a non-tenure track position, just like a tenure track position, they're required, if they're letting you go, to give you 1 year of service before you're officially out. So that is a shared thing. If you're tenure track, you find out in year 6 and use year 7 to leave. if you are not renewed for purposes of budget, you also generally have another year to stay there because they, of course, want to fill, want what's already in the books taught, those sorts of things. So it's what you do. I think that's the major difference. Is that a fair summary, Nuru?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I want to just give this quick example. I worked with a student who was doing pretty much all the things that a tenure track faculty was doing, but it was in a non-tenure track position. Publishing, research, everything. The only difference was that she was not in a tenure position. And then I talked to her and I said, well, if you're doing everything that a tenured faculty person is doing, so why, it seems like you like doing all those things, the research, everything. Unless there's other reasons that I'm not aware of, then why don't you just go for a tenure track? Because in the end, there is a job security. You're doing exactly the same thing as tenured faculty. She thought about it, she agreed, and she went ahead and applied for a tenure track. So the job security is one of the biggest things. And then just longevity in that field, in that institution. So it really just depends on what your value is. And if there are reasons why you may not want to be in a tenured position, that's up to you.
And it can be something as simple as I really want to reverse the proportions. I want to teach more than I do research. It can also be, as people apply for tenure track jobs, how much of your income are you responsible for generating in your tenure track job? Some people have to generate up to 80% of their income from grants, which means they're not really doing the research and the teaching, they're writing grants. So those are important things to also look for and ask, what's the funding for this position, and how long is the funding? Is this a built-in funding? Which my job, for example, is built-in funding. So it's a secure position. It's a long-term funding. I'm going to move us into the next segment with a preliminary interview. So again, think about what questions you might have. And we pulled out a couple of resources to highlight. And yeah, keep on with the questions. These are great questions you're asking us. And again, right now, nearly all of the preliminary interviews are virtual. It takes less money to do that. It also reduces travel time for people to be away from their positions, their families, their other responsibilities. And it helps people understand how you are on camera, because being on camera and teaching synchronously through Zoom sometimes or often is going to be a practice that there's going to be more of. So these ideas here, excuse me, come from several of our colleagues. And Nuru, can you do a talk through while I do some water on my throat?
Sure. Okay. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that you do have an audience for your practice with the interviews, so that you can get a sense of what the pressure feels like with having someone actually focusing and concentrating on you, answering your questions, you asking an actual person the questions that you might have. Make sure that you pay attention to how the interview is being projected in terms of the lighting, the angle, not a busy background. My computer does not allow me to blur or have a virtual background. So it's an older model. So things like that, where know the capacity of your computer. And think of yourself as you may be a student or postdoc currently, but what they're looking for is someone they could imagine as their future colleague. And you need to be able to project that with confidence that you are going to be their future colleague. And not, of course, we all have imposter syndrome wherever we go, something new, something different, but to really ignore those voices that say, you don't belong at that institution, or you should not be an assistant, professor tenure track, or whatever it is you're applying for, but to come in with confidence. And to be actively thinking about what are they looking for? How can you couch your answers in, very specific, taking notes when you're prepping, thinking of that data recording that you're used to doing, right, as a student, as a postdoc, but also remembering that the people you're talking to, whether, online or in person, if it comes to that, they really are eager to find someone they want in their department, right? Someone that they want to be able to call as a colleague, interact on a regular basis, and they're human. And to come as an authentic person, having a lot of things to bring, to contribute to the department, to the field, to your research, and not feeling intimidated, but again, having that sense of confidence that you are at a certain level of your career, ready to move forward in an academic setting, and really wanting to have a good conversation, whether it's a good fit for you or not. You're going to find that out by the end of at least the first rounds. I mean,
Yeah, and I just would add in here, when you're doing the practice, if you film yourself, because you can practice in Zoom and have colleagues be in Zoom space with you. I like that a lot because I'm using that space, and I've done this with graduate students. And I'm going to encourage you to have your colleagues speak back to you about what they saw and what they heard, but to not look at the video yourself, because you become hypercritical. And this is what I've heard from graduate students who've watched the video. They're like, I would never do that again. And listening to my colleagues was really important, in having the practice. So one way my friend Alex, who you're going to see a quote from in a little bit, did that was by having me tape those sessions. So we all gave feedback, and he didn't have access to go back and nitpick at himself. And he felt like that was really important, and partly for that imposter phenomenon thing that Nuru touched on. And we use that word phenomenon because it's created outside of us. We're supposed to feel less than people who have higher titles. It's not inherent in us. It's a systemic thing. So one of the questions here that's already come up from Dana, echoed by Cynthia, is, what do you call people doctors in emails and in interviews? That disrespectful to not to, but, is it too much graduate studenty to do that? And one of the things when it's one-to-one that I've watched a lot of people do when they know it's someone who's teaching and they have a PhD is say, thank you, Professor Andrea Monolina, for that advice, or dear Professor Andrea Monolina, because it's acknowledging the role. And you can also do something simple as hello to start a letter. Be genuine in your salutation. So yes, use it. And if you are also thanking a whole group of people, you can say something like, thank you, doctors, DRS period, and name those folks with their last names. That acknowledges the role, who they are. I still do that when I'm working with faculty in a more formal setting. And with cover letters, those same sorts of things apply. In a cover letter, I might not use hello. Email, I have known lots of people to do that, and had hiring faculty say that they prefer that. Because email is a little less formal than a cover letter. And you can say, hello, hiring committee members, something like that, to acknowledge who you're talking to, and sort of say, this is our context, this is our situation. Nuru.
Yeah, yep, totally agree too. I do refer people by professor, doctor, if I don't know them. And I do that because I didn't do that at one time, and I got an email back from the person saying I would prefer my honorific title of professor or doctor until I know someone well enough to use, their first name. So some people really do pay attention to the titles, and some don't. So sometimes it's also just individual.
And I would say use it uniformly, unless and until they tell you to call them something differently. I've been in situations where people say to me, it's nice to meet you, Dr. Alexander, but they might say to a colleague their first name. And in those cases, sometimes they do that with colleagues who are, I guess the advice I want to offer is, faculty, BIPOC and queer and first generation and international faculty are often called out by their first names, when in the circumstance Nuru described, that honorific is really important to use from the start. And to acknowledge, if nothing else, the professor, the role, the committee members. So make sure you're calling everybody, naming them in the same way, unless and until you're invited to do something different. Just a quick thing here on the screen, some advice from Alex. Again, it's with the preliminary questions. One of the things of putting this in here is more and more, and again, because the positions are mostly in non-research one, but also in research one, people are asking questions in the preliminary interviews about teaching and how you fit, and are you ready to start, or can you be a quick starter? And this is Alex making the point that having some bullet points and key talking points that you want to talk about. And what he did in order to see them and also only be looking at the screen was he had half of his screen set up so he could see the people in Zoom and the other half with his script. So he was always looking at the camera in order to do his responses. He was never looking up to the right in a way or down at a note. A little procedural thing there to think about. So again, we're at a pause place to see if you have more questions related to those preliminary interviews where you have just 20 minutes as usual. And maybe 4 minutes is a long answer. 2 to 3 minutes is common because there might be 5 people on the committee and they're all going to ask you a question and have room for you to ask questions. Are there things we should address here? All right. We keep going on to interviews because there's the other interview where you come to campus, but we have some submitted questions first here, and Nuru is going to take a lead on this particular one.
Yeah.
Which has some thorny elements to it.
Yeah. So the students, my questions about the application etiquette process. I had a first round interview for an assistant professor position in April 2023. I was told I would be contacted within a few weeks about the next steps. The search committee shared that the second round would include an all-day on-campus visit. I did not hear back and sent a couple emails to follow up. I was told things were moving through the large HR system and that I would hear from them soon. Fast forward to September 2023, and I still haven't heard anything. The string, this is the department has not hired for any positions they have posted for in their department. I've seen at least 3 positions posted. I sent one additional follow-up email, but I have not heard back. I do not want to be a pest, but I have never been in a position where I interviewed and that did not receive some kind of notification, whether that can be a rejection or an acceptance. Is this common in the academic search? Do you have any advice on how to handle situations like these? So Eileen and I talked about this, and unfortunately, it is not uncommon. There are departments, institutions that even if you have been invited for the virtual preliminary interview, they might say might bring you for on campus, but then may not follow through for whatever reason. So I have heard of this quite often. And the idea of, being a past, you should be able to ask, where things are in the process. I wouldn't say that you're being a pest, but a part of this that Eileen and I talked about is an opportunity for you to know whether this is the kind of institution you want to actually be at. So remember, when you are interviewing, you're also interviewing them, if this is a place you want to be. And unfortunately, I think I mentioned this in the first workshop we had, the pre-application, that there are students who apply, they get in a tenure track position and they leave within the first 2 to 3 years because it was not the right position, and they saw the red flags along the way, they just ignored them. So I would say if you are constantly asking for an update, where am I, am I moving forward, and you're not getting any feedback or any response, then I would say that's an indication of the kind of place that is in terms of just not being responsive. Maybe they had a change of mind. And I would not push more, because, it may not even quicken the decision any sooner just because you are constantly emailing. But definitely think about, is this the place where I want to be? Eileen, thoughts?
One of the other things we talked about is that this is happening a little bit more often right now. They're not hearing back because of their positions get withdrawn because of pandemic related deficits. So they decide not to fund something. And that doesn't get public notice. It's hard to say to somebody, by the way, we don't have money. Because you might apply later in another time, and that's not also not a good thing for them to advertise fit, or they don't advertise if they feel like it's an unsuccessful search in the perhaps the hiring agent, the next up person, the department chair or the dean says, I need 2 candidates to choose from. You might have been their top candidate, but deans, department chairs, deans, and provosts like having 3 candidates they can choose from. And if they can't satisfy that, they will sometimes cease and an entire search or reopen the search at a later date. So there are all kinds of funky little things that are going to happen in this process. If you want to know about budgeting, you could go to the campus newspaper and search college deficits, and you learn that there's some things going on there. State funding in the head newspaper of a state like the Star Tribune for the Minnesota will carry those kinds of stories. And part of that is just getting the information that you need so you can think about the next time there's an opening if you want to apply for that. Because again, there's a signal there that perhaps this isn't the right fit right now because they're in chaos, or they aren't respectful of the time you put into it to respond to you with the appropriate bit of information.
Yeah, and I had mentioned also to we talked that there was this one institution where they posted a high level academic position, and turned out that the faculty of the institution didn't really want an external candidate in that position, but the institution had not checked with their faculty to see if it should be an internal candidate. And so, external people applied and they did not respond to the external applicants because they kind of didn't want to tell them that they should have checked with their internal faculty first. So there are all kinds of things. We don't know why people do not respond to applicants.
Fun time sometimes, the job search process, and we just want to acknowledge that. Again, think of questions as we're talking. We're going to share a couple of things here from it's not just the committee final interviews, but some of the stages. And Dana, this will be where I get to some things we can say on negotiating startups. And one of the pieces from Alex, again, we did panel interviews with faculty who were hiring agents and newly hired faculty, and that's in our academic job search. So this comes from one of those. Really to think about when you're shaping that interview, what are 3 things that you can hit on? And that's about cognitive load. Make it, and as Alex points out in his second paragraph, consider saying something like, I want to make 3 points about your topic, and it helps people listen. Another piece of advice that he gave in that longer conversation that's not here is this is a great time to have a handout ready for faculty, the people in your audience, when you're ready to go based on the questions and how they interact. So you might have a handout ready that's about they're going to ask you a teaching question, and you put into chat a little bit of a handout that lists the 3 things that you're going to talk about with teaching. So you could do that, and it makes it accessible for people who need to have a printed copy and not just listen. So there are kinds of things that you can do to adapt to the situation. But the 3 things, I'm going to make 3 points, here they are, and then reintroduce them, kept him organized through all of his interviews. And again, thinking about the campus visit, it will be those interviews, but they're going to be conversations with the provost, maybe with undergraduates, with graduate students, if there are graduate students at that campus, and the staff who are part of the process. So you get to showcase your skills via job talks, teaching demos, or a hybrid. And then there are those in-between times where you're both in virtual and in-person times. The chit-chat is you're gathering for the for the 20-minute preliminary interview, the chit chat, if you're gathering for maybe the final interview is also going to be a virtual one, and then you get invited to campus. And you can also ask to meet with people linked to your teaching and your research interests. So this is one place where talking about startups can come in. So when you're talking to the provost, you might ask, what kinds of support for starting up a lab does this campus offer to people in the college or the department where you're applying? Ask those questions. The provost has the big view of funding. One of the things you can do also for talking about startups is ask to meet with people who are 1 or 2 years into being at the university and meet one-on-one in their labs, because you want to see how they've started up a lab and ask them questions about that, so that you're getting what you need. It could also be, that you want to talk to accessibility office, because you have you're going to need to make some accommodations, say for your office, for how you teach. You may need support in grading, and having that conversation by saying, I want to learn about students on campus and support for them, gives you a way to ask your own questions without revealing too much about yourself too early. So again, all those components come in. You're always being interviewed when you're on campus, that part. So thinking about those things. A couple of pieces we wanted to pass along here was some information and impromptu talks, thinking about what you can do when you're in someone's office hanging out, when you're walking down the corridor with someone, when you're in an elevator. I applied for a job at St. Kate's and ended up in the elevator with the president of the university. So I was ready for that. I knew what to ask her. And part of that was, a knowledgeable stranger when I started asking, well, what had she done as research, and what did she notice was interesting research at the university? Can you tell me more about how people teach here? And again, in doing these in between times, think about that future colleague part of yourself as you're doing this. And again, we want to do a little pause here as you're thinking about what's the overall campus visit, see what kinds of questions you have, and we'll talk a little bit more about the teaching demos, the research part, to close this out. But are there general questions you have about the campus visit? Watch for chat over here. I think while we're waiting, Noor, I'm going to go on to the submitted questions.
Okay.
And I noticed, Dana, thank you for adding a question. We'll come back to the ones. Keep adding them, and we're going to address the submitted ones here.
Yeah. So the question is, what is a good way to gauge how the job talk day is going? As Eileen had mentioned, really good technique is to engage your audience by giving them something to, like a synopsis of your research or your teaching approach or whatever it is that you're going to be, presenting to them, and giving them the opportunity to make notes, right, on the card or the piece of paper, half sheet or whatever you're giving out. So seeing how your audience, the people you're interacting with, how engaged they are by what they are doing physically. You can see them doing, jotting notes or typing on computer. So find a way to actually gauge if your audience is paying attention, not on their phone, and seeming to be truly interested in the work and the talk that you're doing. Anything more to add, Eileen, on that first question?
Yeah, I think that thing of having them have something they can interact with is just really huge, whether it's a teaching outline of your teaching session, maybe where you note that I might change this up depending on the audience. So you're also giving them some cues about that wasn't a mistake on my part, that was an intentional decision. But again, they're taking notes, they're seeing what you're doing, especially if they're in an observer role. Give them some guidance so that they can be making notes about something, looking up, and then later they can say to you, hey, when you said that, I see that connects to this, because they've got some things they can point to. The second question, strategies for the grueling campus visit. There's a question in chat, Nuru, that says, how do you pace yourself for a long interview day that could begin in the morning, have lots of meetings, and end with a dinner? So it's a live question here too.
Yeah. And my suggestion is to find a way to just decompress. Again, just remember, you're human, they're human, you're trying to project your future self and have kind of like a decompression process where, if it's a room, and in most places they do give you a room to kind of collect yourself and take a break, water break, snack break, put some things in your bag or whatever it is you're carrying, that will allow you to just reflect a little bit and not feel stressed and rushed. So try to find even 5 minutes just to kind of, take a deep breath and relax and prepare for the next part of the campus visit. Some, really quick energy bars or something that will just get you from, one point to another, and, until you can have like a longer than a 5-minute break. But institutions, departments are trying to build in a little bit more breaks now. Like we, do have, day long, sometimes 2-day interviews on campus. And we try really hard to acknowledge that. And not everybody also has different abilities, and we have different needs too. So just find a way to relax and just, think about each interview and opportunity as it comes.
One of my former students who's now in a hiring position asks people, and she tells them this is her code, would you like to go take a walk to or walk around? So she'll say, would you like to go take a walk around the library and just sort of see what's there? And that is her code for, do you just need a break now? And shall I make room for it? So, people know her well enough to know that's what she's doing, but it's also a way to help open it up and say, I would like to go to the library. Can you point me in that direction? Or other people, when they make those appointments to talk to other people on campus, other units, ask for a half an hour of time to do that, but ask the person you're meeting with for 15 minutes of time. And then you have some time on either end or before it or after it to do that sort of stuff. So those can be also just, I need to take a walk. I'd like to take a walk around campus to get my bearings and see what else is here. That kind of stuff. And if you need accommodations, there will be to ask for that if that's one of the fundamental things they're going to learn about you, or you want to make sure they learn about you. Make sure that they are working to set up your schedule with someone from disability services at that university. I've been on so many search committees where we just automatically say, let people know that accommodations can be requested through this route, and those get taken care of. So where that's a need, look for that kind of information as well. Nuru, you want to do the ones on questions we should ask and should be afraid to ask? And I'm going to check the chat.
Yeah. So I think it's important to know that when you know who you're going to be meeting with, there are certain questions that are for certain types of individuals. So, for example, you may not necessarily ask the same questions to a dean as you might ask a department chair, because these are individuals with different responsibilities. And so just know in advance, and I'm sure they will tell you who you're meeting with and what types of questions would be relevant to what kind of person in what position. So if it's a smaller institution, and if you do get to meet with the president, what are kind of like president type questions versus a department chair or a director of a center. So just know that there are different kind of questions, and definitely do not ask questions that you can find online, because then they'll think like you didn't do your homework. So something like, how many undergrads do you have? I mean, there are a lot of things you can find now online. So use those opportunities to ask about questions that would not be readily available to the public. Also, some of those questions would be about their experience at that institution. Not data that, again, you can probably find online, but how do they how do they determine that, if it's like colleague over a meal, like, what do you enjoy about working here? Or students, how's the experience here so far? And make sure that you're having a positive vibe about that institution. Again, I can't stress enough about how this is also your opportunity to determine if you're going to spend, 3 to 6 years of your life at this place. And also how this will, the decision will affect your family. Because I'm also working with students who have to do that commuting. So think about all of that. If this is a place to worth it to move or to have two homes, because your partner may not be able to go to that place. So just be very careful the kind of questions that you raise, to whom you raise it to.
Yes. And there, along with what Nuru's just added, there are a couple of questions that sort of, I think, relate to questions we could ask. We also put some in the notes field. The notes field for us always has some of our talking points and some further resources. So this notes field has a couple of suggested questions, like asking a provost how they support new faculty at that university, asking a department chair how they support people through the tenure process. Where does a dean, somebody in a leadership position here, see the department going? And those are great questions for people who are, your academic community. But there's a question in here about, schedule flexibility and dinner topics. And one of the things that I encourage people to do with dinner topics, those kinds of questions, is ask about the community. Ask what they like about the community. Are there farmers markets? Are there recreational activities? What's the sort of closest gym if I want to work out? Is there near the university, or does the university support that? Ask community questions at the table, because you're sharing at dinner, because you're showing that you care about being there. Because that's often a fear that they have. Do you want to be in this small town, in this big town, in this whatever town? So asking about the community at dinner is really great. And that way you can also say, so when I'm here tomorrow night and I'm looking for a place to have dinner, where should I go? Where do you go? What do you recommend as a local? For those things like needing a lactation room or a prayer room, if you feel comfortable with your search chair to ask for those things, do that. Some people don't want to reveal religion and family information to search committee members. And in that case, the person on the staff who's wrangling arrangements for you, because it's almost always a staff person who's doing that, setting up the schedule, is a great person to ask. Not only, how can we fit this in? Or as you're setting up my schedule, can you have these time periods? But ask them for maps so that you know how to find it. Let them know, the person who's setting up, I have a couple of scheduling things, like I need to check in with my parents at a particular time because I'm their usual caregiver, and I want to make sure that I do that. I need to make sure that I can find a lactation room or a prayer room at these times, and staff will be good at knowing where those places are. And you're also asking another human being who's negotiating the university in that department, and is not going to say to someone, do you know that she has a child? They're not going to reveal that. Staff are great for confidentiality. So that's one way to sort of manage the need for time. And if you want to do it with your search committee chair, again, when you were saying ask for breaks, don't have to reveal why you need a break between these two events. Just that you do need a break between those two events, and can that happen? Nuru, we had a big question about what the hiring process is. It's a question that's, how do I know what the criteria are, and how they're making the selection? And so I'm going to move us out of this slide and have us address that, but also say, if you've done some interviews, this last part, if there's something that you would pass along, please do that in chat. But I'm just going to move us into this slide so there's less to look at as we get to the final interview. But in the question that's here about, part of it is here in the US, how does this process of hiring work? Are candidates selected based on a vote by members of the search committee? What exactly happens behind the closed doors? the process that we use here at the University of Minnesota, that the faculty we interviewed also use, and it's very much guided by affirmative action requirements, is the job description is the basis for hiring decisions. So if the job description emphasizes research, I'm going to look at your research agenda, your CV, and look at the research. And as I'm screening through the 50 applications I have, and start ranking who has the things that we're seeking out. And what someone will do from an HR office is break down that job description into discrete units and categories. And they're ranked based on, again, that job ad that we keep talking about. And we do the thing of checking off what's there. And if the things that we require aren't all met, that goes in one pile. The requirements that are met go into another. And then there are the questions you get asked that are agreed upon by the committee, and they're asked of every interviewee. And again, those are ranked within the committee. How did they do in answering those? Did they not answer it fully? Did they answer it fully and also give us some new information? Could they not speak to it? Those things, again, get ranked. So say Nuru and I are in competition for the same position. We might have exactly the same criteria. We might have met the requirements. And she may talk more about leadership and have a leadership capacity and capability that I don't do. So she's answered that question in an added dimension. And she can give detail. So there's a little bit of subtlety going on there. So I'm going to become the lesser candidate in that situation. And then it will be a vote on the committee about who do we feel comfortable with comes into it, in terms of comfortable with in meeting these job expectations and being able to move through this process. So it is structured. It's just not a structure that's made transparent, I would say, in most circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Most committees are odd numbered for a reason, because they do need that tiebreaker. And everybody has a take on, what they think a candidate would bring in. One of the things I really want to make sure we talk about before we end today is to make sure that you prepare for the question about diversity, equity, and inclusivity. A lot of institutions are incorporating questions around how do you incorporate diversity, and they're also listening to whether you understand the recent Supreme Court decision on not using race as a factor for diversity, only race. So just really be clear on how you do answer that question, however they present that to you. Because in some search committees I've been on, that has been an issue where candidates do not advance because they either don't really have a clear understanding of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusivity in our education, or they don't know how to answer that question, or they seem to have a very rehearsed canned answer that the committee doesn't think is genuine. Like the person is just saying what they think the committee wants to hear. And committees are very perceptive in terms of, just saying something to appease, but doesn't seem like a really genuine answer. So really pay attention to that in your work, in your training. How do you incorporate your teaching, your approach to undergrad or graduate learning in a way that is inclusive in all forms of diversity?
Yep. In the resource, the academic job search resource, we put into the diversity statement file a new, I think published a couple of weeks ago, article about how to address diversity, inclusion, equity when it's been pulled off the table by legal means in ways, and that teachers still want to know that you have an understanding of how to make learning accessible and how you'll use active learning to engage and structure learning to support a broad range of learners. Those two things become really important in the future. So if you can learn about accessibility in teaching and learning, do that. That's going to be a bonus. And if you're practicing active learning or learning more about active learning, engaged learning across the disciplines, that's going to be useful too. In this last segment, there are 2 slides we wanted to hit on, and there are some others that we just wanted to make sure that you had access to. So I'm going to just do a quick thing here. I'm going to go right to this. Research or job talks, again, thinking about these, who will be in the room, how long do you have, what ways does this department generally just structure research talks and seminars? That's a good thing to find out, because many more are doing interactive ones. And so there's a structure that's already in place that you can use. But again, this is a place to really think about how you're showing how you talk to a public audience that's also got professional elements, and it might be an occasion where they see you as a teacher. You might not have a teaching demo as part of your time on campus, but this then becomes your way to show how you teach, and thinking through what you can do to present, to show how you can talk to generalists, specialists, and do that in a teaching context. To help you think more about that, we've put in some information, some quotes from Monica Schneider, another former student from the University of Minnesota who's now a full professor, who talks through what she wants to hear in answering questions about research. And then we wanted to, call your attention to teaching demos as well, because more and more, again, if it's not your research job talk that's your teaching demo, you may be asked to do one. And there are a variety of ways in which you may be asked to do one. You might be asked to teach in an existing class. You might be asked where you get to select the aims maybe, or you're going to follow exactly what the teacher has decided. And you're just substituting for the teacher in effect. You want to find out who's in the room. Is it at that existing course? Are you simulation? I had a student who had to teach to a class of 1. It was the president of the university. That was fun. So it can range from those things. Other people get asked to write out a class session plan based on a scenario. That's another simulation that can happen. So those questions to ask can be really important, as well as the tools we put in here for ways that you can do some practice and set some things up as you do this. So in this last bit, you might also, as our very last slide for this, again, we have Colin talking about teaching. You might be asked to teach your research. That's becoming a new thing. You're not giving a job talk or a teaching demo, but you're teaching by talking about your research. And think about what one thing you want the students or people in that class to be able to do, or in that session. What will you do to get them there, and what will they do to get there? So again, think active learning when you're doing this sort of stuff. And that brings us up to time. So if you have questions that we didn't get to, we'll take a minute to say, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we can follow up with them when it's not today. And I'm going to repaste the slides and the resources for people who came in a bit later. So there are resources today. And from me, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you, I'm Jean. And we'll see you at another graduate school workshop. Have a
Bye.
good day. Bye-bye.